We're going to take a look at derivatives for the rest of the trig functions, and we're going to start right off with the derivative of tangent. Now you might think, how do we do this? We could set up this whole limit again, limit as h goes to 0 of the tangent of x plus h, and all of that. We're not doing that. There's a much better way to go through. Now we've learned some rules, we're going to use them. One of the rules we have that we actually got last year is that the tangent is equal to sine over cosine. But this gives us now a quotient. So we can take the derivative with the quotient rule, and we remember the little way to sing along with that. Derivative of a quotient is low, d high, derivative of high, and the derivative of sine is, the derivative of sine is cosine, if we do it right. Low d high minus high d low, and the derivative of low, derivative of cosine, is negative sine over the square of low, so cosine squared, we go. So this is going to get us cosine squared x, two negatives, so plus sine squared x, all divided by cosine squared x. And of course you all remember from last year that cosine squared plus sine squared, that's just equal to 1 divided by cosine squared. And finally, 1 over cosine, in the world of identities and reciprocals, 1 over cosine is secant, so 1 over cosine squared is secant squared x. So derivative of tangent is secant squared, and we're going to summarize all of these on the last page, but there's our derivation for tangent's derivative. Next up would be cotangent, and if we think about what we just did, we'll just do it again. So this is the derivative now of cosine over sine, another quotient. This becomes low, d high, derivative of cosine is negative sine, minus high, that's cosine, d low, derivative of sine is another cosine, over the square of low, so over sine squared. We go. So we multiply this out, we get negative sine squared and a minus cosine squared, and all divided by sine squared of x. This negative that we see on both terms can be factored out. That leaves us with a sine squared plus sine squared. Yes, that's going to be 1 again, divided by sine squared. And so we end up with negative 1 over sine squared. 1 over sine is cosecant, so this is negative cosecant squared x. Again, we will summarize that. Take a look at the derivative of secant. Again, we're going to do this the same way. Secant, we just saw, is defined as 1 over the cosine. That's a quotient with a single 1 in the numerator, but it's still a quotient. So the derivative would be low, d high. Well, the derivative of the numerator, the derivative of 1 is 0. Minus high, that's the 1. D low, derivative of cosine is negative sine. And over cosine squared, quotient rule, is over the square of the low. Simplifying, we get a big 0, but then plus sine, so this becomes sine x over cosine squared x. And there are many ways we could write it. We could leave it, we could change it around. I'm going to rewrite this as 1 over cosine multiplied by sine over cosine. This is a standard way to do this, because 1 over cosine is secant, yes, the same secant we started with, times sine over cosine is tangent. Now notice that both of these parts of the derivative have an x in them, so if we were taking the secant of some complicated mess, we'd get secant that mess, tangent the same mess again, and that does present some complications for this derivative. Finally, the last one of these is cosecant, and cosecant is 1 over sine. So in the same way that we just did these, it's low, d high, minus high, d low, over low squared. First whole term goes to 0. This is negative cosine over sine. Breaking it up the same way we broke it up before, we get a negative 1 over sine and a cosine over sine. Make sure you get that that's true. So this becomes negative cosecant and cotangent. So it's a very similar structure that we just saw for secant. Next page is going to just summarize them all up here, and here we go. Derivative of sine we already knew, cosine. The derivative of cosine we already knew, it's negative sine. The four new ones, derivative of tangent is secant squared x. Derivative of cotangent is negative cosecant squared x. Derivative of secant is secant times tangent, both of x. And derivative of cosecant is negative cosecant cotangent of x, each one of x. You need to know all 6 of these, okay? And when you start looking at the work this week, you will see that all 6 are involved. Also involved with this week's work, still power rule and product rule and quotient rule, but now we can include all of the trig derivatives right along with those rules. You'll also notice, just good to see here, that in the world of memorization, at least something holds here. All of the co-functions, all 3 of them, have negative derivatives. And that's a good thing that the consistency holds. And we're going to stop it there, and good luck with the problems.